Let's rewind for a moment, back to when the Brown family first entered the public eye. When sister wives hit TV screens, we were all captivated by their story. There was Kody Brown, the self proclaimed patriarch, surrounded by his four wives Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn, creating this image of the ultimate modern polygamist family. They had it all: love, harmony, and an ever growing fan base that admired their brave choice to live openly with multiple wives. Cody, the leader of this massive household, seemed to have it all together. He was the man of the hour, with four wives and a bunch of kids, all playing their part in this massive family structure. From the outside, their life looked like a well oiled machine. Each wife had her own house in the same city, and they all seemed to embrace the shared dream of being in a polygamous family. It looked like they were living the American dream, but the family was anything but perfect. The whole dynamic on the surface appeared to be running smoothly, but just underneath, cracks were starting to form. While they presented an image of financial success and domestic bliss to the public, the truth was far from that idealized picture. Despite their image of stability, financial troubles started creeping in and the cracks began to show. Foreclosures, evictions, bankruptcy. As the family's fame grew, so did their financial struggles, and yet they kept up appearances, hoping no one would notice. Cody, who had always prided himself on being the provider and the center of the family, was facing mounting pressure behind the scenes. But despite the looming danger of losing their homes and struggling with debt, they stayed on course, continuing to film the show and push out their story. At the heart of this growing storm was Robyn. She had become the emotional anchor of the family, the glue that supposedly held everything together. Robyn was the one Cody turned to, and in the eyes of many fans, she was the stabilizing force that kept their world from falling apart. But, as we all know, nothing is ever as perfect as it seems. And as we move forward, the cracks that were barely noticeable before would begin to spread, threatening to unravel the family's fragile foundation. The cracks that were once small enough to ignore were now too big to hide. As the Brown family's fame continued to rise with sister wives, so did their financial instability. The image of a perfectly functioning, financially secure polygamous family began to unravel before our very eyes. Behind all those smiles and staged family photos, the Brown family was drowning in debt. It wasn't just a few bills they couldn't pay, it was everything. They were facing foreclosure on their homes, eviction notices were popping up, and the looming cloud of bankruptcy threatened to wipe out everything they had worked for. But here's the thing about being on a reality show: the pressure isn't just internal, it's external too. The world was watching them, scrutinizing every move, every purchase, every perfect moment they shared with the cameras. On the outside, they had built this image of a family that lived the dream: four wives, a bunch of kids, and a strong, supportive community. But reality hit hard, and those of us watching from the comfort of our living rooms could see it all start to fall apart. Cody, once the rock solid leader of the Brown family, was starting to crack. The man who seemed to have all the answers, who prided himself on controlling every aspect of his household, was now losing control of the one thing he had worked so hard to build: his family and his finances. Watching him try to maintain his position, even as everything around him began to crumble, was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. He wasn't the strong patriarch we once thought he was. He was just a man who had been overwhelmed by the very thing he claimed to have mastered. But even more than that, there was a growing shift in how the public perceived the Brown family. Once they were seen as groundbreaking and brave, now people were starting to wonder if the whole thing was a scam. Their perfect polygamous lifestyle seemed less like a beautiful alternative to traditional family structures and more like a carefully constructed facade. Social media became the lens through which the public began to see the Browns, and it wasn't pretty. People took to Reddit, TikTok, and other platforms to dissect the family's every move. Fans, once loyal and supportive, began to turn on Cody and Robyn, especially as their financial struggles became more apparent. It was clear that the picture-perfect family they portrayed on TV was a far cry from the reality they were living behind closed doors. And the more they tried to maintain their polished image, the more the public saw through the cracks. The online backlash was swift and harsh. Robyn, who had once been seen as the stabilizing force in the family, now found herself at the center of criticism. Her relationship with Cody, which many had once viewed as the love story that held everything together, was now being scrutinized in the harshest light. Fans on Reddit began calling out the couple for what they perceived as manipulative behavior. Meanwhile, Cody, who had always been the man in charge, was slowly losing his grip on not only his finances, but on the perception of his role as a leader. The public was no longer buying the narrative of the perfect polygamous family. The scrutiny from fans, combined with the family's mounting debt, started to expose what had long been hidden. The Brown family was far from the picture of success they had once projected. The cracks were no longer just visible. They were gaping holes threatening to swallow them whole. As the Browns' world began to fall apart, it became clear that Robyn wasn't just the glue holding the family together. She was also at the heart of the chaos that was unraveling it. At first, many of us saw her as the calming, nurturing presence that brought stability to the family dynamic. But as the financial pressure intensified and cracks in the family's facade grew wider, Robyn's role began to shift. What was once viewed as a supportive partner in Cody's mission to keep everything under control soon started to look more like a key player in the family's spiral toward destruction. Accusations of manipulation and financial recklessness began to surface. As their debt piled up and foreclosure loomed, people started to look at Robyn's decisions through a much harsher lens. Was she really as innocent as she appeared? Or had she been actively steering things in a direction that would ultimately serve her own interests? The more we watched, the more it seemed like Robyn was the one pulling strings behind the scenes. Her relationship with Cody, once seen as a love story that brought hope to the family, became a point of contention. Cody, who had once relied on Robyn to bring him peace and stability, started questioning everything. One of the most jarring things about Robyn's behavior during this time was how she seemed to be deflecting blame at every turn. While the family's financial situation continued to deteriorate, Robyn's attempts to control the narrative became more and more transparent. When confronted with the mounting debt or the growing tension between family members, her instinct was to downplay it or even redirect the blame. She would shift responsibility onto others, often painting herself as the victim or as someone just trying to keep the peace. But as viewers, we couldn't ignore the subtle manipulation behind it all. It wasn't just the financial issues. It was her role in the breakdown of relationships between the wives. While Cody's relationship with Christine and Janelle was deteriorating, Robyn seemed to be positioning herself as the one holding it all together. Yet, when things started to crack, she wasn't just caught in the middle. She was actively working to control the narrative. Robyn's refusal to acknowledge her own role in the family's problems and her attempts to shift blame onto others began to deepen the rift between her and the other wives. She didn't just want to keep things together, she wanted to be the one seen as the savior, even if it meant undermining the rest of the family in the process. The more Cody started questioning his relationship with Robyn, the more she doubled down. The reality that things weren't working between them became impossible to ignore. But instead of facing it head on, Robyn resorted to playing the victim. She tried to make herself appear as the one being unfairly attacked, all while quietly pulling strings in the background. The dynamic between Cody and Robyn became increasingly strained as he began to see that the woman he had put so much trust in might actually be a big part of the problem. Robyn's efforts to manipulate the situation only made things worse. Her attempts to control the family narrative weren't helping her image. They were only driving the wedge between her and the others deeper. Instead of taking responsibility for the part she played in the unraveling of the family, Robyn kept trying to shift the blame, making it clear that her primary concern was self-preservation. As things spiraled out of control, it became less about saving the family and more about saving herself. And in doing so, she only pushed the family further apart. Kody Brown's descent from being the authoritative patriarch of his large family to the broken, isolated man we see now is nothing short of heartbreaking. It's hard to imagine how someone who once carried the weight of a family on his shoulders, boasting confidence and control, could find himself unraveling in such a public way. But that's exactly what happened. Cody, who seemed invincible in the early days of Sister Wives, began to collapse under the weight of his own decisions, not just financially, but emotionally and personally. From the very beginning, Cody's identity was wrapped up in being the leader. He was the patriarch, the provider, the one who promised to keep his family united. His role as a husband to four women, his fatherhood, and his financial responsibility, it was all on him. But as the cracks in his carefully constructed world started to show, it became painfully clear that the facade of control was slipping. The weight of sister wives, their reality TV fame, and the financial strain was more than he could bear. And the pressure only intensified when his marriages, the very cornerstone of his identity, began to fall apart. The first major blow to Cody's sense of self came when Christine decided she had enough. After years of trying to make the marriage work, Christine's decision to leave him sent shockwaves through the entire family. For Cody, this wasn't just a marital failure, it was a personal one. Christine wasn't just another wife. She was the one who stood by him in the early days, the one who helped him build the family he wanted. Losing her wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the beginning of Cody's unraveling. His guilt over the breakdown of their marriage hit him hard, but rather than confronting it directly, he seemed to retreat into denial, unable to face the reality of how far things had fallen. But it wasn't just Christine. Janelle, too, began to pull away from Cody. The relationship, which once seemed solid, began to erode. Janelle's growing frustration with Cody's behavior and his inability to manage the family's finances was a tipping point. Cody couldn't escape the growing realization that his actions, or lack thereof, were driving his wives away. The emotional toll of losing Christine, and now Janelle, was devastating. It wasn't just his marriages that were crumbling. It was his entire worldview, the identity he had worked so hard to build, that was falling apart. What's even more painful to watch is how Cody, once so sure of his power and control, began to grapple with the consequences of his choices. He wasn't just losing his wives, he was losing his place in the family. His children, many of whom had once idolized him, started to see the cracks in the image their father had built. Cody's relationships with his kids became strained as his emotional instability and erratic behavior took its toll. He found himself in a position he had never anticipated. The person who had once been the pillar of his family was now adrift, trying to hold on to what little was left. The guilt and regret that followed his failed marriages were overwhelming. You could see it in his eyes. The weight of knowing that he had failed not just as a husband, but as a father and as a leader. And as much as Cody tried to project strength, his actions showed something different. A man desperate to salvage the pieces of his life, but too broken to do so. What's truly tragic about Cody's journey is that, despite all the power he once held, he was left in the end without the one thing that truly mattered: a united family. The emotional toll on Cody was immeasurable. He was facing not just the collapse of his relationships, but the very core of his identity. He had promised his family a life built on unity, stability, and shared values. But in the end, it was those very promises, those ideals, that were shattered. And as he watched Christine and Janelle leave one by one, it became impossible to ignore the deep void that was left behind. Cody wasn't just losing his wives, he was losing his family, his future, and the dream he had sold to the world. And no amount of deflection, no amount of blame shifting could mask the fact that Cody's downfall was in many ways of his own making. In the aftermath of the Brown family's collapse, the themes of personal responsibility, betrayal, and the destructive effects of greed and control linger heavily. Family members like Dayton Brown and Mary have been vocal in their criticism, refusing to be part of Cody's narrative. Dayton especially didn't hold back in calling out Robyn's manipulative behavior, exposing the cracks that had long been hidden behind the scenes. Mary, too, distanced herself from Cody's toxic cycle, rejecting his desperate attempts to rewrite the story and keep the narrative in his favor. What does the Brown family have left after the chaos? A shattered legacy? They've lost the image of a united, perfect, polygamous family, the one that was showcased on TV for all to see. They've lost the trust of each other and of the public. And most painfully, they've lost the illusion that forever is something that can be built on lies and manipulation. But in this wreckage, there's also a hard-earned lesson. personal responsibility matters. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. Relationships need self awareness,